"Jenny, this table is for family, go find a spot outside." I froze for a moment, my heart skipping like a broken record, pounding so loud it felt like everyone in the restaurant could hear it. My cousin laughed sharp, knowing, the kind of laugh that makes you want to either cry or explode with rage. I sat down, forcing my hands to rest on the table, trying not to show the storm boiling inside me, while she sat back, smiling as if she had just won something she didn't even deserve. Then the waiter placed a bill in front of me. $3,400. My hands trembled for just a second before I took a sip of coffee, the bitter heat grounding me, keeping my mind from flying out of my chest. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes, my aunt's lips pressed tightly together, my uncle's jaw clenched like he was holding back words that could start a war, and my cousin's grin stretching wide, sharp with satisfaction. I pushed the bill back. Just a small deliberate motion, barely noticeable, but it carried all the words I couldn't say out loud. My cousin's eyes flicked to mine, a flash of confusion crossing her face before it hardened into something sharper, more calculating. She had expected me to fold, to pull out my wallet and hand over the money like I had done so many times before, like I was still the same person who swallowed humiliation for the sake of family dinners. "You always like to make a show," I said quietly, letting the words roll out, soft but precise. "You set this up to see if I'd bend, to see if I'd let you laugh at me again." She tilted her head, her smile a little forced now, the power in her gaze starting to waver. The room shifted around us, a tense, invisible current, everyone sensing the confrontation that was about to explode. I could have apologized. I could have said something to lighten the mood, to pretend I hadn't noticed the trap she set, but I didn't. I had spent years letting the world decide what my role was, watching as people treated me like a background character in their own stories. Not tonight. Tonight I controlled the narrative. I slid my phone across the table, the screen lighting up with a recording I had saved months ago, a recording that would speak louder than any argument or raised voice. My cousin's laughter from that past day filled the room again, raw and unguarded, and I watched as her confident mask began to crack. Faces around the table turned toward us, curiosity and shock mixing in their expressions. I sat there calm, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of truth sink into every corner of the room. This wasn't about money. This was about reclaiming dignity that had been pawned off as jokes and challenges for too long. I leaned back, taking another sip of coffee, savoring the bitter heat as it steadied me. The $3,400 bill was no longer a trap. It was a test, and I had passed on my own terms. The choice to push it back, to refuse their expectations, had shifted something in the room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a crack in the illusion of control that my cousin had always wielded. I could see it now, the way her hands twitched toward the bill, as if to reclaim authority, but she hesitated. The table was quiet, the usual chatter of family dinners replaced by the weight of unspoken truths. I smiled, a small, quiet victory, knowing that I had finally chosen my own terms. I didn't need to yell, didn't need to demand respect. I had earned it simply by refusing to let them dictate the narrative. I stood slowly, folding my napkin with deliberate care. "This isn't about money," I said softly, looking around at everyone who had expected the usual performance. "It's about respect, something that some of us have never learned to ask for, but tonight I don't need permission." My cousin's face paled, the smirk gone, replaced by the first hints of uncertainty. I walked out, leaving the bill untouched, leaving the expectation of humiliation behind me, and finally stepping into a space that was entirely my own. I stepped out into the rain, letting the cold drizzle wash over me, as if it could cleanse not just my skin but the weight of every insult I had carried for years. My coat clung to me, heavy with wet, but I didn't care. The air was sharp and biting, and each breath felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Inside the restaurant, I could still see them through the window, faces frozen between shock and anger, and I realized something important. Control was intoxicating, but even the most confident can crumble when someone refuses to play by their rules. I walked to the edge of the sidewalk, letting my heels splash through puddles, my mind spinning faster than the rain around me. Every detail of tonight, the laughter, the bill, the subtle arrogance, replayed in vivid color. It wasn't just about money, it never had been. It was about proving to them and to myself that I could stand up without yelling, without begging for recognition, without falling into the trap they had always set. I had taken the first step, but the real game, the real revenge, had just begun. The phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking my focus. A message from someone I hadn't expected to hear from tonight, a tip, an ally, a nudge in the right direction. I smiled faintly. That was the thing about plans. Sometimes the pieces you thought were missing were already moving in your favor. I typed back quickly, curt and deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. I'm ready, let's do this carefully. Minutes later, I ducked into a narrow alley to make the call I had been putting off for weeks. Every nerve in my body was alert, every sense heightened. I could almost hear the past sneers echoing behind me. Every time they had underestimated me, every moment they had laughed at my expense, it all fueled the calm fury simmering beneath my skin. I had learned early that anger could either destroy you or sharpen you, and tonight it would be the latter. The voice on the other end was low, measured, professional. Are you sure about this? Timing matters. I've never been more sure, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging outside. They've already revealed their arrogance tonight. They think I'm still the same person they can push around. That makes everything easier. Plans began to form, intricate, surgical in their precision. It wasn't about causing pain for the sake of it. No, that would be petty, and I was beyond petty now. It was about teaching them a lesson they couldn't ignore, a lesson wrapped in truth, exposure, and inevitability. The kind of lesson that sinks in quietly but lasts forever. I thought about my cousin, how her laughter had always been sharper than knives, how she had weaponized every family gathering to make me feel small. And yet, there she was tonight, face frozen when I refused to play her game. That first pushback had tasted sweeter than I expected. I could almost feel the power shifting, as if the air around her had subtly bent in my favor. By the time I ended the call, rain had soaked me through, but I didn't move. I stayed under the flickering streetlight, letting the cold and wet sharpen my focus. Every detail of tonight, the bill, the recording, the looks around the table, was a step in a long chain. And now the chain had links I was controlling. I returned home, dripping mud and water marking my heels, and collapsed onto my sofa. My mind didn't rest, didn't stop, didn't forgive. It replayed every family dinner where I had been the punchline, every meeting where my ideas were dismissed, every sneer and snicker I had swallowed quietly. And now, each memory was ammunition. Each insult was fuel for what I was about to do next. I opened my laptop, logging into accounts I hadn't touched in months. Files I had archived, notes I had made in secret, plans, recordings, evidence were all there. Every meeting, every transaction, every whispered conversation that could be turned to light against them. The digital trails of arrogance, carelessness, and deceit were now weapons I could wield, silently, invisibly, and effectively. Hours passed. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, but my mind raced with scenarios, timing, and consequences. I calculated, I plotted, I imagined the moments I would reveal the truth. Not out of spite, not for spectacle, but because some people never learn unless reality itself forces them to listen. And I intended to make sure they listened. When I finally rested my hands, it was with a sense of calm satisfaction. This wasn't impulsive, it wasn't reckless. Every move I planned would be precise, every revelation deliberate. The lesson had begun with a pushback of a bill, but the story was far from over. This was only chapter 1 in a book I intended to write in real life, where I held the pen, the ink, and the timing. Sleep came eventually, light and uneasy, with fragments of tomorrow spilling into dreams. I saw faces contorted in surprise, whispers frozen midair, and a cousin who never knew when to stop laughing. I woke with clarity. The next day, the next move would be even more calculated, even more subtle, even more devastating. By morning, I had a plan in mind. Every conversation, every social media post, every family interaction would become a calculated move on a board I had finally learned to see clearly. The arrogance they displayed tonight, the sense of ownership over family, over me, it was a mistake they would pay for. And I was patient, precise, and ready. I moved through the day like a shadow with purpose. Every coffee shop visit, every casual smile, every nod to a stranger was a piece of observation, a note in my mental ledger. I was seeing vulnerabilities I had never noticed, habits, predictable reactions, and I filed them away silently. Jenny, they thought, was just playing along. Jenny, they assumed, would continue to be small. Jenny was about to become the architect of consequences they couldn't escape. By evening, the first subtle threads of action were in motion. Emails, messages, and quiet inquiries were sent. Small nudges, just enough to make the family feel a disturbance in their carefully curated world. Nothing explosive yet, nothing overt, but the first cracks had appeared. And I watched, with meticulous attention, as the seeds I had planted began to sprout. Every night I reminded myself, revenge is not about rage, not about shouting, not about spectacle. It is about precision, control, and inevitability. And as I lay in bed, the city lights reflecting on my ceiling, I allowed a small, private smile. The game had begun, the first moves had been made, and tonight Jenny was no longer a spectator in her own life. The sun that morning felt like a spotlight. I woke with the taste of rain and steel in my mouth, the kind of clarity that tightened every muscle and made every decision feel inevitable. For months I had rehearsed the moves in my head until they were second nature, how to make them listen, how to make them see the truth without me having to shout it into existence. What I wanted was not to humiliate for pleasure. I wanted to rearrange facts so thoroughly that the old narrative, the one where I was small, quiet, the family punchline, couldn't survive in the light. Today the stage would be public, today the ledger would be balanced. I dressed with that cold, deliberate care I had seen in women on the other side of histories, the ones who fixed everything by showing up. My coat was practical, my shoes painfully sensible. I braided my hair because I like the way the rhythm keeps my thoughts in check. The envelope I had handed the waiter last time sat heavy in my bag. It had looked like a quiet thing, paper folded into paper, but inside was the key, deeds, signed transfers, the bank correspondence, and a notarized chain of custody that proved a lie they'd built their life on. I had waited until the right moment to pull the thread. They had chosen tonight with a laugh and a bill. I would repay them with truth and a deadline. I arrived at the family gathering early. It was a fundraiser, an event where keeping appearances was a religion. The hall smelled like expensive perfume and desperation. They always selected venues that whispered success, crystal chandeliers, polished floors, servers who moved like trained shadows. That had been their brand, not just wealth but the show of wealth, the stagecraft of superiority. They were experts at performance. I was about to steal the script. When I walked in, there were the usual ornaments of family pride, people I'd known forever with their practiced smiles and allegiances. My cousin Maya saw me and found it easy to register a look of pleasant, condescending surprise. For a moment she looked ready to take delight in me as she always had, but there was something in my face she hadn't accounted for, an absence of plea. She had thought of me as someone pliant, a constant filler in the background noise. Today my silence was a weapon. I didn't speak to everyone. I moved through the room like someone reconnoitering a map she'd drawn herself. I sent 2 messages that were short, precise, and designed to fold time in on itself, one to a reporter who owed me a favor, one to an old client of Maya's construction business who had once been promised transparency and later fed polite lies. Both messages contained the same sentence: meet me by the stage in 15 minutes. The sentence alone had a pinch-point quality. It made the ordinary afternoon into an appointment. People like Maya are used to controlling space because control is baked into their identity. The idea that someone else would set the pace made them itch. When the band started, soft strings to keep the night cozy, I requested the microphone. It wasn't theatrical, it was procedural. I was on the donor registry list, I said, and women like me know how to use formalities to carve openings. 20 seconds later, the event organizer, slightly flustered but helpless in the face of donors, gestured me forward. I took the mic as if it were a prop I'd been born to handle. My voice was steady, the softer tones that force people to lean in rather than fight you. It disarmed them, and disarmament was part of the plan. I have a short announcement, I began, and their faces folded into curiosity. People love an announcement because it promises drama without effort. It concerns a property and a promise. I watched Maya's eyes narrow. A slight ripple of amusement passed through her group. This was expected. They were smiling already, halfway through their judgment. I pulled out a tablet and set it on the lectern. A slideshow shifted onto the large screen behind me, documents, scanned pages, signatures magnified like confessions. It started with the deed to the shop on 7th, a small bakery that had once belonged to my grandmother. The deed showed an original signature, a transfer, and then a subsequent forged signature. I let the silence between each slide stretch, measured and precise. People read the handwriting and the dates, and did that slow recalibration you make when a puzzle doesn't fit. What you are seeing, I said, is not a family dispute. It is the careful theft of a legacy, a transfer executed without the right to sign. It's a transaction that happened while the rightful owner was in the hospital, unable to consent. It is something that required a little collusion, a lot of assumption, and a serious ability to perform righteousness in public while operating without scruples in private. I watched them absorb the words. There were gasps, tiny murmurs, shuffles of cocktail napkins. The lights turned toward Maya as if by choreography. Her face showed the first sign of panic I had ever witnessed. Small, almost ashamed, but still a face that tried to dress the feeling with defiance. That's the dangerous part of a person like her. She could move from panic to performance in an instant. I handed the microphone to the organizer and walked down to the first table where my aunt sat, grief like a shadow in her eyes. I placed a printed stack of letters on the table, emails from Maya's company asking for expedited transfer, the invoices showing payment to an attorney who later disavowed knowledge of the client, the bank statements where funds were moved without proper notarization. The paper felt thin and ordinary, but it was heavy with consequence. I did not shout. I did not point fingers. I let the documents do their quiet, inexorable work. Then the reporter came up. He had my number, he'd been a friend once, and he knew how to turn a scandal into a line. He asked the first question in the language of public accountability. Are you prepared to press charges? I looked at Maya, who was now pale, then at the table of relatives whose murmurs sounded like an approaching tide. Yes, I said. I've already filed paperwork. The attorney has verified the chain of signatures. There were witnesses who can attest to coercion. That was the simple, devastating truth. For months I had been gathering testimony from those who had feared speaking up, an assistant who'd been paid to stay silent, a neighbor who'd seen Maya sign a document at the hospital with her hand shaking, a bank clerk who'd reported irregularities and been ignored. They were all small people who had been told to stay small. I had stitched their stories into a rope and pulled until it tightened around the lies. Maya tried to speak, to redirect, to laugh. You can see the motions in people who have always believed themselves the heroic narrator. Blame someone else, quick jokes, a sudden display of injured dignity. But tonight the room had new contours. The camera phones twitched like netting, people recorded the exchange, and the watchers outside the circle were growing in number by the minute. Words have weight, and once evidence meets voice they acquire momentum. But the legal reveal was just one blade. I had prepared for reputational fallout because image is the oxygen of people like Maya. I released whispers to her colleagues and to a few influential clients, small facts about unpaid taxes, contractors who'd been paid late or not at all, projects that had been mismanaged. The rumor mill churns fast in tight social circles. Within hours, 2 of Maya's contracts were put on hold. A board member of one of her projects called her privately and asked for documentation she couldn't produce on the spot. When you remove oxygen, even the brightest torch struggles. Yet even as the facts fell into place, I wanted them to feel the human cost. For that I needed a final, public twist. I had arranged for the bakery, the one that had once been my grandmother's and that Maya had claimed as part of her empire, to open an anniversary celebration that evening in its new rightful hands. The bakery was small, crowded, and intimate. It served bread and memory and the scent of yeast that makes people softer. I had arranged for the keys to be handed over to the community board while the fundraising gala still hummed. News of the transfer spread like perfume. It was a symbolic gesture, community reclaiming what was taken, but symbolism matters when you live by appearances. As the gala wound down, phones buzzed with pictures from an entirely different crowd. People at the fundraiser checked their feeds and saw images, an elderly woman from the neighborhood holding a ribbon, community kids with flour on their faces, the shop's old sign restored. The story on the screen at the gala had become 2 stories at once, the fall of an empire and the rise of the thing it had stolen. The effect was subtle and brutal. People who came to admire wealth found themselves following a thread of empathy toward an old woman and a group of kids baking bread. Maya left the gala early. I followed not to confront her with more words but to watch the exit. She stood on the sidewalk, phone to her ear, voice thin and urgent. She realized that everything she had built was shivering under scrutiny. Power built on theft is brittle, and once people find the crack, they pry. I wanted her to have the moment everyone else had that night, the sudden sensation of being unadorned, unprotected, entirely visible. She turned and saw me. There was a flicker of something that could have been recognition or the reflex of an old habit, to call me small, to ask me to explain how I had the nerve. Instead, she only said one sentence, the kind women like her use when they need to sound reasonable. Jenny, she said, this is a mistake. We can fix this for the family. I looked at her and thought of every time she'd fixed the story by making me the scapegoat. The childhood games where I'd be the dog in the family play, the grown-up parties where my earnings were a punchline, the times she'd smiled over me like I was scenery. I had not come to justify, I had come to close a door. No, I said simply, the word landed like a shutter. You already had your chance. Fixing things isn't your strong suit when it means giving back. Her face crumpled into the tired thing it was, part anger, part calculation. She made the mistake of asking, why are you so cold? As if kindness was my default and confrontation was some aberration. The truth is, revenge isn't cold when it's just. Revenge is the heat you generate when you decide not to be consumed. It's a warmth that builds around the bones and turns fear into practical action. The weeks that followed were slow, precise, and clinical. Lawyers moved with the certain patience of people used to converting events into documents. There were hearings, mediated agreements, and a small, searing exchange where Maya's legal representative had to admit a thing in public that she had always whispered in private. She'd signed without authorization because it was convenient. Convenience, it turns out, is an excellent legal enemy. The court ordered restitution and the reversal of the transfer. Maya's clients began to whisper, her projects were reassessed. The bakery returned to the community with a clean title and a plaque that read simply, "For those who remember where they came from." I went to the ribbon cutting with muddy shoes and a quiet smile. But the real victory wasn't the legal paperwork or the return of property. It was the change in the room when I entered family gatherings afterward. They watched me differently now, not because I had shouted, not because I had made a spectacle, but because I had shifted the ledger. People who'd once expected me to bend noticed that my shoulders didn't. My aunt, who had once folded into passive shapes, began to call me on the phone more often, asking small questions. Those tiny, ordinary changes matter. They are the scaffolding of a life rebuilt. There were losses, of course. Some relatives thought I had gone too far. They removed me from group chats and interpreted my actions as a betrayal of privacy. A cousin who had been particularly close texted, "We loved you." It was the classic, sickening guilt line of those who confuse justice with disloyalty. I took a breath and let it go. You can't hold everyone's opinions in your hands without losing the shape of your life. One evening, months later, I stood in the bakery as the sun spilled like honey across the counter. A little girl with flour on her nose laughed, and an old man told a story about a bread recipe my grandmother used to make. I listened, letting the warmth fill me. Revenge, I discovered, had been misnamed all along. It wasn't about breaking them. It was about building back what had been stolen, about insisting on histories that deserved to be told. It was about the dignity of simple things: a name, a legal signature, the right to your own story. Maya's life moved on another trajectory. She found clients who were willing to trust her for a time. She reinvented, retold, and reassembled. People are flexible. They reframe themselves to survive. But whenever our paths crossed at weddings or funerals, there was a stretch of distance now, an unspoken accounting. We were both older, both changed, but the difference was she carried her old tools like a weight and I carried my choices like armor. I chose the day I stopped being small. That choice gave knock-on effects. It freed my aunt to speak her mind, it allowed a community to reclaim a piece of its history, and it returned a shop to hands that would need bread with respect. On my way home from one of those quiet evenings, I stopped at a crosswalk. A car paused. Its driver giving me a nod the way strangers do when they've seen your photo in the paper and have decided you are a person worth acknowledging. I raised my hand slightly, an ordinary gesture. In that small movement was everything I'd wanted, not vindication shouted from rooftops, but a life that could hold its own light. When I look back now, I see that the story began with a single bill pushed back across a table. It wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. It cracked the complacency that had allowed small cruelties to compound into theft. The final act wasn't an explosion. It was a sequence of small, resolute moves, evidence collected, allies courted, symbolic gestures made. That's how most real changes happen, not with fireworks but with patient, intentional pressure until the brittle things break. I still remember the first time I pushed that bill. I remember the tiny shock that rippled the table and the way my cousin's smile faltered. I remember thinking for the first time in my life that my dignity was something I owned, not something I paid for. The rest followed, not because I wanted revenge as a headline, but because I wanted to live without the weight of other people's scripts. In the end, the victory tasted like warm bread and rain-washed air. It tasted like the right kind of justice, precise, restorative, and quietly inevitable.